First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here again. It's a real pleasure to come here always. Pat Westhoff sends his apologies for not being here. He'd love to have been here, especially this year, given the celebrations. He's actually attending another anniversary celebration for our Texas partners at the moment. I got the better side of this, I think, by coming to here, definitely. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about agricultural markets, global markets, and what's impacting things on the short run, and try and pull out some of our longer run drivers. And then I'm going to talk about the policy environment as well and try and make a link between those two things. So we do an outlook as well. Our outlook is released earlier on in the year. You can see my publication up here, our publication up here. It was released in March. So you might have noticed things have changed a little bit since March. So I'm not going to use many of the figures that come from that publication. Actually, next week, we're all going to get together. We're going to run the models again and produce a new outlook. So sometime, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, you'll see an update to this, which will have more information on it. So you'll be able to access that through our website. One of the things that have been driving things and why things are different are obviously weather. Weather is the key thing here driving the short-run markets at the moment. And we've seen some pretty extreme weather impacts here over this growing season and this year so far. In the US, for example, where I'm in Columbia, Missouri, which is right in the middle of the US. We had a big drought here coming up until the beginning of August. We were in the highest state of drought, I think, in a lot of places around us. And then so far this August, we've had a lot of moisture, which has meant that we might be getting a record wet August after having an extreme drought beforehand. So if you drive north from Columbia up towards the main corn growing areas, you'll see some very patchy corn. Some people do well where they've got some rain, some others not so well. So that's been the corn. The rain was too late for the corn. I think it's in time for some of the beans. So you'll maybe see some improvements in forecasts for the bean crop here in the soybean crop for here in the US. In Europe as well, we've had drought in the south there. I've got dryness across Europe, but a lot of that's been replaced by rain. I speak to my parents. My parents live in Shrewsbury in England, and they've had remarkably similar weather to we had in Columbia, Missouri. In England, they've had the hottest June on record, followed by the wettest July. So it's kind of weird to me that how those two things so far apart can be similar. When you look at I'll touch on the short-term outlook here in a second. That's reliant on big crops coming from South America that are going to be impacted by El Nino. But the other thing, obviously, that's been impacted markets here is Ukraine. Just today, a report written by Pat Westhoff was published in Choices magazine, which I think everybody can access online. So if you want more detail and an analysis of how that has impacted markets, then that's available out there at the moment. For now, I've just got on here what came out on last week's WASDE from the USDA and what they're expecting in their global projections to happen in Ukraine here. And it's interesting to look. The solid bars here are production. Blue is wheat, green is corn, and then you've got exports across the top. So even though production dropped pretty heavily in 22-23, I think there's been some surprise at the volume of product that's been able to come out of Ukraine for wheat and corn, but also for things like sunflower as well. Some of that's been pulling down stocks. Obviously, with the ending of the agreement and an increase in hostilities there, we're probably expecting trade to drop. So that's going to be an area of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next year. This is going to have long-run impacts. Even if the conflict is ended, there's been destruction of facilities, disruption in transportation infrastructure. That's going to mean that this is going to have implications that reach into the future here. So generally, it's a difficult thing for us to assume what to do in our outlook. We have no idea what's going to happen here. So just for the sake of assuming something, we generally think over the next few years that things can return to somewhere near normal or whatever. But that's going to be something that's going to have a very big impact. And what I've done is, when I've pulled out the WASDE figures for next year here, I've broken out Ukraine here so we can see whereabouts it's impacting markets. So you can see at the top there on the right, I have the latest projections from WASDE for maize here. And you can see they revised maize down a little bit this time around relative to July because of some of the weather issues around the world. So we're just below another record crop. But we're still, this is the second biggest crop on record here. For the US, we're having, we've had problems with drought, but that's only in some parts of the Midwest there. And also we planted a lot of corn this year. That's 94 million acres of corn here, so that was pretty hard. So we're actually going to have an increased amount of corn coming out from the US, and coupled with Brazil, those figures kind of dwarfed Ukraine. So even Ukraine has dropped their production levels. The impact on the corn market is much less than on some of the other crops. So we've got ending stocks going up, and what I've done is I've put in yesterday's futures prices here, just as a guide of where we are. So over the longer term, the futures prices on here are probably in the range where we've been projected in the last few baselines. We're talking about $200 corn, maybe a bit higher, and something like $230 wheat, maybe a bit higher there. I don't know where we're going to come out next week when we redo the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if we weren't too far away from those. So what we're really talking about is a situation where prices are lower than they've been over the last couple of years, but maybe higher than they've been in the preceding decade for those things there. For wheat, obviously, Ukraine has a bigger part of the global market, but you can see on there that EU and Russia themselves have both stepped up in their production here, producing more there to offset the drop in the Ukraine production. So we're still having more wheat next year coming out. Just to a bit of an abstract way of looking at what's happening on the farm here. This is just for the US, and this is from March, so this will change in our next projections here. Dotted line are revenues. On the bottom here, we have some of the variable expenses here. It doesn't include land or machinery. If you go back to 14-15 up until 2018, low corn prices means the gap between those lines were pretty low. Higher prices now widen the gap. We have seen an increase in costs here. These are crop years here, so 22-23 is the crop that was harvested in 22. That's why 23 is kind of high for expenses for fertilizer. That's for the crop that's in the ground at the moment. Fertilizer costs actually are down there, but other costs have kept the total cost high. So over time, we're expecting a reduction in fertilizer prices. Those have happened already. We've seen fertilizer prices come down, but other costs staying pretty high in the future period. That's part of the reason why we have prices in the future higher than we might have seen over the past decade here, settling higher than that. Since 2018, also, we've only had below trend corn yields. So you can imagine this year, if we'd have actually had a great corn yield, we planted all that corn, then the story would be very different. We'd have a much bigger drop in that line. Obviously, in our projections, we assume average year, normal weather for our projections, and so we end up with a bigger margin there for the future years for corn. Another big reason why the prices are higher is because of the demand from China. China has been importing a lot more corn obviously than it used to do historically, and that's pushing the prices up. We're expecting that to continue into the future. So corn, a big driver of our story. China, a big driver of our story for grains and for things like soybean meal. I've got oil seeds up here. A similar situation for those. In the US, probably a bit better yields this year, but we planted bean area with corn this year. So we see our production going down. Again, we're relying on a big crop coming out of South America to make that up. We have a probably well-supplied oilseed market, which has seen the oilseed prices drop. What I've done here for the 22-23 year, that's the crop year according to, for the US, that's October, September crop years. All I've done is assume that for the rest of the year, the current price stays in place. So current market prices are actually below those at the moment. And for our medium term here, I think in the past we've shown sunflower prices. I think the last time we did these, they were around 530 or something. Our soybean prices were a bit lower than that going out into the future. You can see here, again, ending stocks for soybeans increasing, while ending stocks for sunflower are going down. Ukraine as well, playing a big part of sunflower markets. Part of the reason why the sunflower hit from Ukraine hasn't been felt more keenly is if we look at sunflower area here, these are pulled out EU because there's some interesting stories for each of these. The middle one is sunflower here. You can see that after averaging just over 4 million hectares of sunflower in the EU, we've seen a bump up to over 5 million hectares here for the last couple of years for sunflower. So a bit more sunflower coming out of the EU. The EU put a policy in place to increase protein crop area. That has increased our soybeans up to about 1 million hectares, but we don't expect that's going to get much bigger into the future. And you can see that in post-2018, there was a big drop in rapeseed area as some of the conditions, what you could plant for rapeseed were changed. We've seen that rise again in recent years here as people adjust to that change, and probably on the back of high prices too. One of the key drivers here is going to be biofuels. Probably the last time I was here and gave a presentation, I said, well, there's not going to be much change in the US and the EU here, and it won't be as big a driver as it was, back at the beginning of the BFAP baselines. But we've seen in the last year, because of policy changes in the US and the big demand for renewable diesel, that had a big impact on oilseed markets and vegetable oil prices earlier on in the year when the EPA said that they were going to have a lower requirement for that than many people in the market thought that was driving it. So this was one of the big things back in January that was driving our markets, was what assumption we made about biodiesel in the US. And that was impacting everything else. It impacts the demand for oil, that impacts the demand for the beans, and that impacts other oilseeds and other crops as well. So this was a big driver, and it's going to continue to be in the future. We have ethanol pretty flat at the moment, but that all depends on electrification of the vehicle fleet. If we see a fast electrification, less need for fuel, and that will lead to a drop in biofuels as well. So that's going to be a key driver going forward. If we think about meat prices here, meat prices also have been up. We had record levels here. So this is from the FAO. For each of the different years. The top year is 2022, and the red dotted line is what's happened so far this year. So we've seen prices coming down a little bit. We'd expect chicken and pork prices to follow feed prices to come down relatively quickly. Now, obviously, the markets are less integrated than they are for cereals, especially for beef. So your experience for beef has been very different from the UK, from the EU and the US, where we've had strong demand post-COVID, pulling up prices. But because of a drought, for example, in the US, our cattle herd in the US was still decreasing, I think, our cow numbers. So we haven't been able to react to that. So we've got very high prices there that we think are going to persist for longer. The lower prices of other meats will pull those down, but I think in the next few years, especially in the EU and the US, we're likely to see pretty high beef prices. Again, China is a huge part of this and has driven the pork market in particular over the last few years. I was just looking at the USDA PS&D figures for data, and so if you take the last 5 years, the additional pork that's on the market in China is equivalent to the whole production of the US. So really what we assume about some countries doesn't really matter about as how much happens in China. China's been driving everything over the last 10 years, especially probably the last 20 years, and we think that that's probably going to happen in the future here. Also, it's really impacted dairy. This is my job is to do dairy, and this was an area where I've been very wrong this year. I mean, we look at long-run milk production and we say, okay, EU, New Zealand, Australia, all of those countries are likely to restrict their production because they're trying to meet climate change goals. So their cow numbers are fixed. So we'd be going to the US people and saying, I'm always like, yes, your export markets, you're going to have a lot of success in export markets here because the US has been increasing dairy production. But what happened this year? China has reduced the amount of dairy product it's been purchasing, and you can see what's happened on the red line there. A significant decrease in prices. Again, if you look at what China has done with production over the last 5 years, they've added another Canada in terms of dairy production. So we're just talking about massive changes, and that's part of the reason why they're importing corn, and part of the reason why our long-run corn prices are higher than they have been in the past. So this is good news if you're an exporter of soybean meal or corn. Bad news if you're an exporter of meat or dairy. What they choose to do in the future regarding their mix of producing feed or producing meat is obviously going to be a big driver of what goes on there. Just to speak a little bit about policy here, I've got on here US expenditure on agricultural support. The blue, the yellow, and the green are all part what's in the Farm Bill. You can see they vary over time. The yellow is the orange is crop insurance subsidies, which have increased over time. The thing to point out here on these ones is, in the last few years under the Trump administration, there was a lot of extra money that was put into the sector that increased. So, we've had higher prices. We've also had higher payments here that have fed into the sector. And that's had an impact on the sector too. When we got a Farm Bill coming up, I think both there's it's not like other policies and other discussions. These tend to be bipartisan. So we'd expect there would be an agreement here. I think people are working towards an agreement. The main takeaway from the US is there's probably likely to change expenditure, but they're not going to be that important in terms of production or price impacts. Whereas what we see in Europe is the opposite here. We're expecting that the EU changes are actually going to have an impact on markets. But, whereas in the past we always thought of your EU support boosting production, here we're looking at policy changes reducing production, increasing costs for producers. And that tends to, that means another part of that is going to be that as producers are forced to meet these higher standards, they're going to be an increase in calls for more protection there. So one thing we can think about is, what's the interlinkage between policy and these market changes themselves? We think that we're having more shocks, we're having less response in production and consumption to shocks, so that's leading to more volatility in the market. One policy response has been an increase in the more frequent use of export controls there. So that's been, especially from India, we've seen that in the rice market here. We can see big increases in prices there. We've also seen input price disruption. In the US, they may look at trying to address find a way of helping producers deal with those input price changes. But I don't think there's enough money there to put a whole big new expensive scheme in place. And for Europe, consumers are putting more requirements on the way that food is produced. So the main thing I was wanting to link this all into was a real change in the trading environment here. I mean, what we used to do when BFAP started 20 years ago, we were in an environment where we were just starting the Doha round, right? We were going to keep cutting tariffs. And I think that everybody was thinking, okay, it's just a matter of time. We're gradually eliminating tariffs and trade barriers. We're moving towards free trade. Well, especially over the last couple of years, it doesn't look as if we're doing that anymore. Even as tariffs have reduced, these non-tariff barriers have become more important. So the existing ones are more visible, and the new ones have come into, there's been pressure for the new ones to come into effect. So an example of this might be the citrus here, where you negotiate extra market access, and then producers in the European Union seek more protection, and then there's a non-tariff barrier put in place. And in the US, we've seen the same thing with maize. NAFTA liberalized the maize market. Now the Mexicans are bringing in restrictions on GMO corn. So you see this thing happening all the time. And COVID has kind of added to this. I think it's led to calls for self-sufficiency and more focus on domestic security. So we think that, this is going to be a feature of what's going on. So on the one hand, we have more volatile markets. At the same time, we're likely to have more trade disputes. The WTO has become weaker. And so how are those going to be dealt with? And, there's a trend towards more deals, more than free trade agreements. How that impacts you is going to be a mixed bag, I think. We're already looking into a renegotiation of AGOA, or even though the US has become more protectionist, they're also can't produce everything they need, and they're looking for sources for products from outside of China. So that's one side of things, and hopefully that way, there can be more agreements there, and then you can get negotiate access for other products as well as part of those new agreements. So basically, that's what we have: more volatile markets and potentially more ad hoc trade restrictions. So if you're an exporter, that has the potential for being a very volatile, an increase in volatility here in the future that you might face. Sorry, I went well over my time then, but I'd just like to say thank you again for the group and everything they've done here. And don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or anything. Thanks.